Alexei Kosygin's phone finally rang and an apologetic Kremlin aide came on the line. The call he'd made to save 1 billion lives hadn't gone through, the aide explained, because a telephone operator in Beijing had first refused to connect him to China's chairman, Mao Zedong, and then showered invective before hanging up. Kosygin ordered his diplomats in Beijing to begin an unsuccessful hunt for Mao's direct number. Either kill the tiger or be eaten by him, Mao had said in a famous 1949 speech. A message that ignoring Kosygin's desperate calls was meant to underline. The previous week, on the 15th of March 1969, People's Liberation Army troops had occupied the ice-bound Soviet island of Damansky, sparking off ferocious fighting between the one-time Marxist allies. Fears of escalation grew, raising the prospect that China might eventually end up using its brand new medium-range ballistic missiles, armed, by the way, with the only nuclear warheads ever flight-tested over populated areas. For centuries, leaders have used not talking as a means of crisis communication, just as often as they've used dialogue. Last month, India's former High Commissioner to Islamabad, Ajay Bisaria, revealed in his memoirs that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is also skilled at communicating by not picking up the phone. Even as panic grew in Pakistan that India was planning missile strikes during the Balakot crisis, a move that would have ratcheted up the confrontation, the Prime Minister declined a midnight call from his counterpart Imran Khan. Earlier, Modi himself said a night of slaughter, Qatl ki Raat, would have ensued if Pakistan had failed to agree on the release of captured Indian Air Force pilot Abhinandan Varthaman that day. Not taking the call was clearly intended to signal that India was serious. Ever since that night, New Delhi has mostly stonewalled Islamabad's efforts to begin talking again. Even though some covert dialogue has taken place, and the two armies have maintained a ceasefire on the line of control, India has rejected Pakistan's appeals for even minor concessions on Kashmir. Former Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif's call for negotiations received no hearing in Delhi. Following last week's rigging-tainted elections in Pakistan, though, it's clear Islamabad will get a new incumbent in the Prime Minister's office one of these days. Prime Minister Modi will then get calls, and he'll have to make calls on how he wants to address this new landscape we're seeing in our western neighbour. Little imagination is needed to understand why New Delhi is so reluctant to talk. The road from the Lahore summit, after all, led on to Kargil and the 2001 attack on Parliament House in Delhi. Like Manmohan Singh got 2611, Modi received Pathankot and Uri for his efforts to make peace. Pakistan's generals systematically littered mines on the road to peace. 24 hours after India's strikes on Balakot, Lieutenant General Tariq Khan, who later became one of Imran Khan's most consistent advocates among former military commanders, argued for retaliation, even though others serving in the armed forces were extremely torn or reluctant. Each Indian cross-border strike, General Khan noted, eroded, and I quote, Pakistan's position of deterring war through our nuclear capability. That in turn, he argued, meant, and I quote again, we become more and more vulnerable to an asymmetric conventional threat. That is, India had more conventional power than Pakistan, but if Pakistan wasn't willing to use its nuclear weapons to deter them, India would get to use that conventional force without having to think twice. Thus, General Khan went on, quote, our response should be to escalate and push the envelope of hostilities so that nuclear war is a likely outcome. India, Khan argued, quote, simply will not go down this road. As the larger, richer state, it had more to lose in an all-out conflict than Pakistan. Ever since 2001, though, Pakistani generals have known the kind of policy General Khan advocated for is becoming ever more unsustainable. In 1970, the GDP of Pakistan and India were pretty much the same. Today, India's GDP is 8 times the size of Pakistan. Even India's per capita GDP, despite its much larger population, is around 50% higher than that of Pakistan. The Pakistan's army ability to spend money on itself is also diminishing, analysts John Gravatt and Andrew MacDonald have noted. Though the Pakistan army has managed to ensure its budgets are not slashed, every Pakistani rupee is worth less and less in terms of dollars needed to import military equipment than they used to be the previous day. The resilient electoral performance of Imran Khan, despite the deck having been stacked against him by the army, will have made clear to generals the costs of devouring resources, even as the polity reels amidst economic crisis. As early as 2002, when General Pervez Musharraf launched a secret peace process in Kashmir, together with Prime Minister Vajpayee, he had come to understand this fundamental truth. Pakistan simply could not bear the costs of crisis, let alone war. Lieutenant General Moinuddin Haider and Lieutenant General Javed Qazi, scholar George Perkovich notes, told Musharraf investors would not come to a Pakistan that kept ending up in some confrontation with India every year. Even though the Pakistan army successfully deterred India in 2001-2002, it entered into the first ceasefire on the line of control and shut the tap on infiltration. This set the stage for a long decline of violence in Kashmir. Even if the India-Pakistan relationship has bitter hostility baked into it, it's often been served drenched in a sauce of mawkish sentimentalism. The treacly poetry and sort of ecstatic polemic which overlaid Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's 1999 visit to Pakistan, or Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's description of the India-Pakistan peace process as irreversible just 3 years before 26/11, are examples. Even Modi famously arrived impromptu for Pakistan Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's granddaughter's wedding, armed with a gift of a hot pink turban, signifying brotherhood. The truth, however, is that this apparent sentimentalism actually conceals or paints over a hard-nosed realism. Talking to Pakistan has yielded multiple reductions in violence, whether after 2003 or after 2021, after the parliament crisis or after Balakot. Even though the peace on the line of control might have been imperfect, it's better than crisis. For India, peace with Pakistan will allow scaling back its substantial economic commitment to securing counter-insurgency forces in Kashmir and to protecting the line of control. Those resources can be used to deal with the challenge from China. The China-Russia crisis of 1969 is a useful prism for policymakers in Islamabad too. For Pakistan, that crisis holds out instructive lessons on the pointlessness of games of bluff. The Chinese posture was just performance theatre intended to deter the Soviets, the United States intelligence analyst Thomas Hughes recorded in a classified note at the time. The growing danger, Hughes added in his memo, is that Peking might be miscalculating and the tactics meant to deter wider conflict with the Soviets will in fact end up bringing it on. That's a lesson for Pakistan too. The 1969 crisis should teach India similarly about the limits of what force alone can achieve. The Soviet Union was militarily and economically superior to China in all respects. Finally, Russia was deterred by the reality that even defeating China would have only created an anarchic, fractured neighbor that posed even more of a threat than the status quo. There's no telling, of course, how deep the changes in Pakistan's military thinking are, or if it will revive jihadism in Kashmir, as the economy eventually improves. The army, as the eminent scholar Christine Fair has argued, is an epistemic community. That means a group bound together by inherited knowledge and values. Inside Pakistan's army, which drew its legitimacy by being a Praetorian Guard of Islam against so-called Hindu India, normalization was cast as an existential threat. The roots of this thinking lie in the late 1940s when Pakistan army officers fought alongside tribal irregulars in an effort to seize Kashmir. Brigadier Akbar Khan, who led the campaign, believed the war for Kashmir had been betrayed by an effete political leadership and tried staging a coup, which would have been Pakistan's first. Following religious rioting in 1953, Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan found himself ceding a growing share of power to General Ayub Khan, with the military casting itself as a modernizing institution. The famous scholar Samuel Huntington, the man who came up with the Clash of Civilizations idea, hailed General Ayub's basic democracy project, which restricted electoral franchise to sidestep East Pakistani electoral power and ruled instead through the backing of West Pakistan's landed elites. Anyway, Huntington called this a prerequisite of political stability in a modernizing country. In fact, Ayub's choking of democracy ended up empowering the Islamists. Following Pakistan's very first election with universal franchise held in 1970, the country disintegrated, with Bangladesh seceding. Islam became a seductive ideological force, promising to restore the so-called founding values of the country. And in 1973, Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who played a key role in precipitating two wars with India, succumbed to Islamist pressure and passed a new constitution which decreed that sovereignty over the whole universe belongs to Almighty Allah alone. The regime General Muhammad Zia-ul Haq built after executing Prime Minister Bhutto rebuilt the state around these ideas. Anti-India positions flowed from a broader commitment to jihadism, an ideological commitment. General Zia, Fair notes, energetically advocated Brigadier S.K. Malik's pro-jihad rant, The Quranic Conception of War, saying that its contribution to Pakistan was enormous. Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto chose not to roll back the religious legislation. In 1998, her successor, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, even considered legislation that would have declared him the Amirul Mu'mineen, or Commander of the Faithful, a title used, by the way, by the medieval caliphs and the Taliban's founder leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar. Those ideas have lived on, nurtured by successive governments because of the Pakistan military's stranglehold on the country's strategic thinking. Even now, the Pakistan army refuses to completely dismantle its safe haven and patronage to some terrorist groups. Learning lessons from the past, India has become cautious, therefore, about the whole idea of making peace with Pakistan. There's one thing that will be worse, though, which is war. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm a contributing editor at ThePrint. Thank you for watching Security Code.